Security advisor H.R. McMaster is out. This had been rumored for legitimately half a year. One of the things that was really funny is that last week Trump tweeted out that H.R. McMaster was completely secure in his job. He also tweeted out that one of his lawyers, a guy named John Dowd, was completely secure in his job. And then that guy left. The media had reported both of them were on the outs. Trump, of course, says fake news. It turns out that was not fake news, because when Trump says fake news, it's only fake news like 40% of the time. Well, the guy who's replacing H.R. McMaster was sort of a foreign policy establishment guy. He's somebody who believed in sort of realpolitik balance of power. He tended to be relatively kind of weirdly interventionist in certain areas and non-interventionist in other. He had kind of a squishy view of the Iran deal. John Bolton's views are extraordinarily clear. John Bolton is the person who I'd wanted for Secretary of State. I think he'd be better in that role than as NSA, but I'm happy to have him inside the administration. Bolton, of course, was ambassador to the UN under George W. Bush. He is not a neocon. People have said that he's a neocon. He is not. To define neocon, there are really two definitions of neocon. Definition number one is the historical definition, which is somebody who was a lefty during the 1960s and then realized the errors of their ways. They were, in the popular phrase, mugged by reality and became more conservative. It was a specific movement of very heavily Jewish people in the 1960s, like Irving Kristol and Daniel Bell, who's not Jewish but was a member of these. These were the neocons in the 1970s, the people who had shifted over to the other side. Bolton was always a conservative. So by that definition, he's not a neocon. The other definition that's used is about people like Paul Wolfowitz, who are very into nation building, the idea that we're supposed to go into Iraq, knock over Saddam, and then stay there and build up the nation. That was actually not something that Bolton suggested doing. He said we had to get rid of Saddam because Saddam was funding terrorism and pursuing weapons of mass destruction, according to every intelligence agency on earth. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have turned the country back over to the Iraqis as soon as humanly possible, instead of sticking around and pouring hundreds of thousands of more troops in there. So he's been called a nation-building neocon for a while, and that's not true. He wasn't in favor of the Arab Spring, for example. He is not averse to leaving American allies who happen to be dictators in power. He was in favor of leaving Hosni Mubarak in power in Egypt. So he is not a democracy-first neocon in that sense. So people are mischaracterizing the situation. Democrats, of course, are going nuts over this. Chris Matthews, no, they say that John Bolton, look at that mustache. Look at John Bolton. I get over here, rumple my hair, suits all wrinkled. I just roll in here and I do a show. John Bolton, that guy even has a mustache, though. And I said to my wife, Kathleen, do you even like mustache? She said, no. MSNBC Hardball, go.
John Bolton, Mr. Hawk, because he promised the working men and women of those states that voted for him, the gritty factory workers and other people who didn't like these wars because their kids do all the fighting and getting killed and losing their legs and everything else. He said to them, no more stupid wars. Now he brings in the godfather of stupid wars, John Bolton. Anyway, the congressman has been with us. Thank you so much, Eric Swalwell of California.
He's the godfather of stupid wars, John Bolton. It was John Bolton's fault. John Bolton was like Undersecretary of State for Near East Affairs or something like at the time. So, again, the idea that John Bolton was the architect of the Iraq War is just not true. It is not true. He was in favor of a broader Syrian intervention. I want to go through John Bolton's record a little bit. What exactly is John Bolton's actual record? So here's an editorial that he wrote in 2012 about the situation in Syria. What he said was, as hostilities in Syria roll on unabated, the civilian casualties rise because of combat operations in urban areas and execution-style killings. In response, calls for U.S. military intervention of one sort or another continue to aid the opposition increase, while the Obama administration dithers over whether to continue relying on the UN Security Council and former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. But what are America's interests at stake, and what is the best way to protect them? Although it is easy to concentrate on the stomach-churning television images, we should operate on the basis of strategy, not emotion. That doesn't mean doing nothing, but neither does it mean knee-jerk reactions instead of careful analysis. He says that regime change in Syria is prima facie in America's best interest, as well as the interests of Israel and our Arab friends in the region, who see nothing but danger for themselves if Iran's hegemonic ambitions unfold successfully. He says there's no reason to coddle Assad. He says that we should have supported the Syrian opposition. He says the possibility of getting rid of Assad is now more remote, given the widespread infiltration of the anti-Assad forces by al-Qaeda and other terrorists. In truth, we don't know enough about the opposition's political or military leadership to predict who would prevail in the immediate aftermath of Assad's overthrow. This is John Bolton writing about Syria in 2012. In such circumstances, the risk of a radical Islamist replacing Assad is considerably higher than it would have been if we had moved to oust him years ago. A relatively orderly exit by Assad is one thing. A disorderly, indeed chaotic exit is quite another, especially given the risk that Syria's chemical and biological weapons assets, and maybe even nuclear assets, might fall into the hands of people even worse than Assad. And then he talks about the humanitarian considerations, and he says without substantial on-the-ground troop presence, we cannot prevent all of that brutality and evil. So he sort of evaluates the whole situation And he says his bottom line is Obama's not up to the job in Syria. The gravest risk of American involvement is that his administration and Iran might find common ground in the Middle East chess game. Iran would allow Assad to fall, losing its pawn, and in exchange, Obama would agree to do even less than he's doing now to stop Iran's nuclear weapons program. So he says we should cut Syria off from its major supporters. Here's his actual program. Cut Syria off from its major supporters. Russia should be told in no uncertain terms it can forget about sustained good relations with the United States as long as it continues to back Assad. We should resume full-scale, indeed accelerated efforts to construct limited missile defense systems designed by George W. Bush to protect America's territory against Russia and other rogue states. He says we should announce our withdrawal from the New START arms control treaty. And then we should tell Iran that our patience with their decade-long ploy of using diplomacy to gain time to advance their nuclear weapons program has ended. Tehran should face a stark choice, and we can leave to their imagination what will happen if they fail immediately to dismantle all aspects of their existing nuclear effort. And we should also reverse the fantasy that despite its repeated violation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, that Iran is entitled to a peaceful nuclear program. And then he says, finally, in Syria itself, we should do now what we have begun to do 10 years ago. Find Syrian rebel leaders who are truly secular and who oppose radical Islam, who will disavow al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, and other terrorist groups, and who will reject Russian and Iranian hegemony over their country. We'll need some reason to believe the opposition can prevail against Assad. So this is not a guy who's saying, let's go in and knock over Assad willy-nilly, right? This is a guy who's actually taking into account the situation on the ground in Syria and taking a pretty anti-Russian perspective, right? For all the people on the left who are claiming that Trump is in thrall to the Russians, John Bolton certainly is not in thrall to the Russians. In fact, I have the evidence that John Bolton is not in thrall to the Russians. Here's what John Bolton had to say about Russian sanctions just a few months ago. This is in December 2016.
The Russians have walked all over the Obama administration for 8 years. It's really been a pathetic performance. So what this last burst of activity has to do is hard to say. I do think it's intended to try and box the Trump administration in. I think it will fail. This is simply an executive order. If President Trump decides to reverse it, it's easy enough to do. If you make them feel pain and others feel pain, then the possibility of deterring future conduct like this increases. That's what we need to do.
Okay, so obviously John Bolton is not a pansy for Russia, right? And this is a guy who's very, very harsh on Russia. He's also very harsh on Iran. He's very harsh on Syria. Now, people have said that he's a warmonger. What's hilarious about this is that he's been in favor of a lot of the same wars Democrats were in favor of, right? Libya was actually Hillary Clinton's war. Now, what he said, what Bolton said about Libya is that we should oust Gaddafi. I think that he was wrong about that, right? He had said this back in 2011, I believe, that we should kill Muammar Gaddafi. It was in March 2011. He said that there was a risk of terrorist takeover. He says one of the things the administration should be doing is identifying pro-American, pro-Western leaders in the opposition and assisting them. I don't see any evidence they're doing that now. But this is a rare case of a Gaddafi on the one hand, the unknown on the other. I'd pick the unknown. Obviously, that was wrong. You shouldn't pick the unknown. You should pick what you know, unfortunately. But, you know, again, the idea that Bolton is some sort of wild cowboy who's out there stumping for war in all cases is not correct. Here's what Bolton had to say about the Iran deal. So Trump's entire national security team now, right? He's got Mike Pompeo over at State, and he's got Bolton as NSA. All of them are anti-Iran deal, which is a good thing because the Iran deal is a debacle and a disaster. Here's Bolton just a few years ago talking about the stupidity and evils of the Iran deal.
But let's be clear what America's interest is. This deal was a strategic debacle. Not only is it bad for the United States in the big picture, the terms of the deal are bad. You can't hold them to the terms of a deal that are as amorphous and unclear and subject to multiple interpretations as this deal is. I think the only thing that we can do to try and get back on the right track is to say the deal's over. I am confident Iran was violating it before the ink was dry. They're doing it still today. And, you know, unless you're content to have Iran on an unimpeded path to deliverable nuclear weapons, this deal has to be scrapped.
Okay, so there's no question that he's a hawk, but he's also not a neocon in the sense of nation building. Bolton has defended the war in Iraq. Here's what he said years ago, I believe it's 2009, talking about the war in Iraq and why it was justified.
Were we right to go to war?
I don't think there's any question that the decision to overthrow Saddam Hussein was the correct decision. I think you have to look at what happened in Iraq through the prism of two separate questions. Was the initial decision correct, and was what happened subsequently the way we wanted it to be? The answer to the first question, to me, despite the events of the 6 years after the invasion, is still unquestionably yes. The regime itself, Saddam Hussein, his Ba'ath Party, were threats to peace and security in the region and the larger world.
Okay, so a lot of people on the left are very upset about that because it's become conventional wisdom to say that the Iraq war was wrong. Based on the evidence that we had at the time, the Iraq war was not wrong. The The pursuit of how we did the Iraq War was wrong, and members of the Bush administration have acknowledged as much. Again, you can only go to war based on the evidence that you have in front of you. Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, Al Gore, John Kerry, every Democrat, Nancy Pelosi, all of them supported the Iraq War because the evidence that was put in front of them was very different from the evidence that was later gathered. Now, the real reason that people are upset about Bolton in the NSA position is because they're afraid that he's such a hawk. He'll go to Trump, he'll talk a bunch of hawkery into Trump's ear, and suddenly we'll be at war. And the reason that they're saying this is because Bolton has been particularly harsh on North Korea. So he just wrote an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal in February 28th, 2018, so not even a month ago, in which he talked about the legal case for striking North Korea first. Right? He talked about preemption, and what he said is this: preemption opponents argue action is not justified because Pyongyang does not constitute an imminent threat. They are wrong. The threat is imminent, and the case against preemption rests on the misinterpretation of a standard that derives from pre-nuclear, pre-ballistic missile times. Given the gaps in U.S. intelligence about North Korea, we should not wait until the very last minute. That would risk striking after the North has deliverable nuclear weapons, a much more dangerous situation. So he's not actually making the case for a preemptive strike. He is saying that it is legal. He's saying this is how we should think about the threat of nuclear warheads delivered by ballistic missiles. In 1837, Britain unleashed preemptive fire and fury against a wooden steamboat. It is perfectly legitimate for the United States to respond to the current necessity posed by North Korea's nuclear weapons by striking first. Now, do I think Bolton's going to walk into that office and say to Trump, let's attack North Korea? I do not. I don't think that's who Bolton is. Now, I've met John Bolton several times. I do not think that Ambassador Bolton will now, NSA Bolton, is a guy who is going to pander to Trump's worst instincts in terms of hitting buttons that fire missiles. I think that he knows he's now part of an administration where the guy at the top is not supremely stable with regard to the use of force, for example. And I think that knowing that, he is going to be pretty careful about what he says to the president. The good news is the president trusts Bolton, the president trusts Pompeo, the president trusts Mattis, and the three of them, I think, make a much better team than H.R. McMaster, Rex Tillerson, and Mattis. I mean, there's no question that's a better team overall in terms of a conservative foreign policy, a Bushian but non-neoconservative foreign policy, which I think is more realistic, but not paleo-conservative. Trump campaign is a paleocon. He is not a paleocon.